Hello, and welcome to this video, which will cover Human Rights Committee advocacy for the upcoming review of Ethiopia. This video will focus on how to prepare for engagement with the list of issues stage of the Human Rights Committee's review. My name is Amy Berquist. I'm a senior staff attorney with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights, and I'll be leading you through this video. Here's the agenda for the video. First, we'll do an introduction. Then we'll do an overview of the Human Rights Committee's reporting procedure and where we are in that process for the Human Rights Committee's review of Ethiopia. Then we'll do a deep dive into the list of issues stage of the review, the key documents, the opportunities for civil society engagement with the process, and then we'll take you through the 10 steps to writing a report for the list of issues so that you can get involved in the process. First, the introduction. The Advocates for Human Rights is a non-governmental organization based in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States, and we work to implement international human rights standards in order to promote civil society and reinforce the rule of law. We have special consultative status with the United Nations. That means that we can do some things at the United Nations that other organizations can't. For example, we can deliver speeches or oral statements at the Human Rights Council and submit written statements to the Human Rights Council. We also work with partner organizations to help build their capacity to engage with the United Nations. In working with our partner organizations, whether on the ground in the countries of concern or partner organizations in the diaspora, we find that in a lot of cases, it's very useful to link the global and the local. In particular, using international human rights standards and international human rights mechanisms as one of many tools to press for social change in the individual targeted country. So no one tool alone is going to create change, but leveraging the authority of the United Nations can oftentimes push the government of a particular country to move in the right direction. So oftentimes our partners say that it's very useful to have this pressure coming from the United Nations to help amplify their voices and try to persuade the government to do the right thing. It's not the only tool in the toolkit, but it's certainly an important thing not to neglect the opportunity to engage with United Nations mechanisms and to reference these international human rights standards when you're doing your advocacy. By way of a brief overview of the international human rights system, I won't go into too much detail here, but you should know that there are a lot of different components to the international human rights system. There is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which acts as sort of the bureaucratic superstructure for a lot of the United Nations mechanisms that touch on human rights. There's also the Human Rights Council, which is the more political body of human rights at the United Nations, where governments are represented at the council, and it's typically a peer-to-peer mechanism. Then we have the treaty monitoring bodies, which is what we'll focus on today. These are committees of independent experts that review countries' human rights record as it pertains to treaties that countries have decided to ratify. Then there are, of course, a lot of other regional and other human rights bodies that engage on human rights. There's the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, for example, the International Criminal Court, and various bodies that deal with human rights as well. Treaty-based mechanisms, though, will be our focus, and by way of introduction, it's important to note that these treaty-based mechanisms don't apply unless the country, in this case Ethiopia, has ratified the treaty. So if they haven't ratified the treaty, then the treaty-based mechanism can't really say or do anything about it. Each treaty monitoring body, typically called committees, like this today we'll focus on the Human Rights Committee, is made up of independent experts who interpret the treaty. That's their job, and they're not representing a particular country, although they're from, of course, various countries, but they're representing themselves in their individual capacity as experts, and they look at the treaty, say what the treaty means, in particular with respect to how a country is implementing its obligations under the treaty. The committees have regional geographic representation, so the experts aren't all from one particular region of the world, and their meetings are generally held at Palais Wilson in Geneva, Switzerland, which is what you see in the photo here. So now we'll do an overview of the Human Rights Committee's reporting procedure. And this is a procedure if a country has ratified the relevant treaty, which in this case is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, then that country has agreed to participate in this reporting procedure. So I'll give you an overview of that now. This is the treaty monitoring body reporting cycle, and you'll see that the boxes along the circle are numbered. So we'll start with number 1, and this happened in late 2019, early 2020 for Ethiopia. The government, or the state party to the treaty in this case, submits a state party report. So the government of Ethiopia submitted its report late last year, early this year. And so now we're in between stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2, which will happen later this year, probably end of October, early November, is the treaty body, in this case the Human Rights Committee, presents the state party with a list of issues. And the list of issues is a formal document that asks for additional information and focuses on particular issues that the treaty body experts are particularly concerned about or particularly interested in learning more about. You'll see that there's an arrow in between those two, and that's an opportunity for NGO or non-governmental organization involvement. Now that could be individuals, it could be groups. There's not really any limitation on who can engage with the treaty body at this process, but you can help influence what the treaty body asks about and what issues the treaty body decides to focus on. So that's what we're focusing on here today. But I think it's helpful for you to know the overall process so you can see where all of this is going. It's a cyclical process, as you can see. So after the treaty body presents the state party with a list of issues, then the state party gets a chance to respond. So they typically respond in writing. They'll go over this formal document that asks for information, poses questions, and the state party will give a written response. Then later on, and this will probably happen in 2021, maybe early 2022, the government will send a delegation to Geneva to meet in person with the committee members, with the experts. And this is usually approximately a 6-hour session where the committee member experts will ask a lot of questions of the state party representatives, of the government representatives. Government representatives will present information, respond to questions, and then, now we're at step 4, that constructive dialogue. After that, a few weeks later, then the treaty body experts will issue their concluding observations and recommendations. That's stage 5 of the cycle. And these concluding observations and recommendations are really the summation of what's happened in this cycle of the review. And in this summation, the treaty body experts will say, we commend the government for doing these things, for making this progress, but they will also express concern about particular issues that they have highlighted in the constructive dialogue, things that they've heard about from civil society. And most important, they'll make recommendations for how the government can better uphold its rights under the particular treaty at issue. So they'll make those recommendations, and the next step in the process is for the government to take those recommendations and to make best efforts to implement those recommendations. So the government has the obligation to implement the recommendations the treaty body makes, and then the government, sometime later, typically 5 years later, sometimes it's a bit longer, the government will submit a new state party report explaining what its progress has been, what it's done since the last review to implement the recommendations to better uphold the obligations under the treaty. So that's the overall cycle. And as you can see, there are numerous points along the way where civil society can participate in this process to help shape the dialogue and to help shape the outcomes of the process and to help shape what the government does in response to the process as well. So that's the overall cycle. And again, where we are in the process right now for Ethiopia is between steps 1 and 2. The state party has submitted its report, and the treaty body, in this case the Human Rights Committee, is getting prepared to present the government of Ethiopia with a list of issues. That's where we want to get involved. So the list of issues, civil society reports. A main way that you can shape what the committee does in this list of issues is to submit reports to the committee experts so that they know what to focus on. So that's what we'll talk about next. In the list of issues, these civil society reports that go to the committee, as I said, publishes a list of issues which helps focus the state party's report and the committee's upcoming review. So it's going to focus what's going to happen during the constructive dialogue, and it will also focus what the issues are that will be focused on in the concluding observations and recommendations. So if you want to participate in this stage of the process, your goals should be threefold. First, to ensure that your issues, whatever issues you're concerned about, are included in the list of issues. So to make sure that the experts say, oh yes, this is a concern, we want to make sure we ask about it, we want to make sure we talk about it in the list of issues, so that it will be part of our discussion going forward. The second goal should be to obtain information from the state party. And oftentimes in the list of issues, the committee members are just asking, tell us, give us statistics about this, give us more information about this. And civil society may also want that information. It might be information civil society has been asking the government for, but hasn't received any response. It might be about topics where there just isn't coverage in the media and you want to know what's happening, but you can use the committee experts as a way to extract information from the government by encouraging the experts to ask those questions, to request that information in the list of issues. Then the next step is to, or the next goal is to identify problems or gaps in the state party report. So in this case, we have a lengthy report from the government of Ethiopia, and you can look over that report and see whether there are any flaws in it. Are there some things that the report ignores? Are there some things where the government report isn't truthful? Are there things where the government just kind of ignores the realities on the ground? And another goal that you can have in making your report at this stage is to identify some of those problems and gaps in the state party report. There are several key documents that we want to look at this stage of the process. First is the treaty itself. And the treaty we're looking at here is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Then we want to look back to when the committee last reviewed Ethiopia's human rights record. And that was in 2011. And you can look at the concluding observations from that last review to see what was the committee interested in then and what recommendations did the committee make to the government of Ethiopia at that stage. Because if you think back to the cycle, that's what they're looking back toward, is what happened last time, what did we recommend last time, and what has happened since that time in terms of implementation. What has the government done to implement the recommendations from last time around? In some cases, there is a follow-up reporting process. The committee will ask for particular topics for the government to respond quickly within 1 or 2 years to implement, really quick fixes. And so you can look back to that. There may be also a common core document where the government creates a general document describing the country's legal system, describing some of the general principles. And this is a document that the government will use for all of the different treaty bodies. So it's kind of a generic document. So that is sometimes a relevant document. And then of course, the state party report, which we have here, the government's official report showing what it's done to implement the committee's last recommendations and to comply with its obligations under the treaty. Our audience, when we're writing civil society reports at the list of issues stage, you may think, well, who are we writing this for? First and foremost, our audience is the treaty body experts. So those are the independent experts who sit on the committee. In a lot of cases, they are professors who do this as sort of a side gig. It's not a paid job to be a committee expert. So they're often professors whose universities support this work. They're able to draw on research assistance from students. But these treaty body experts are your primary audience because they're the ones who will be conducting the review. But you may also have other audiences for your report as you're thinking about preparing it. You may want to use your report for the general public to educate them about the information that you have to share, or use your report as a tool to educate the media and to get media attention about your issues. And you may also have as an audience for your report the authorities in Ethiopia. You may want to use your report to get their attention to say, hey, we're really concerned about this particular issue that we're seeing happening in Ethiopia, and we're concerned about it. We would like you to take action. So think about your audience as you prepare to do a report. These are the treaty body experts right now on the Human Rights Committee. You can see their names, the different countries they're from, and so on. But these are the experts who are your primary audience on the Human Rights Committee. And if you think about your audience, these Human Rights Committee members are going to be your voice on the ground in Geneva. They are going to be the ones that are engaging with, having a constructive dialogue with the government of Ethiopia when the time comes next year. So here you see at the top, in the top two photos, you see 3 of the members of the treaty body, 3 of these independent experts. They're asking questions of the government of Uzbekistan. And you can see the government delegation from Uzbekistan becoming quite animated in responding to some of the questions that the treaty body experts have posed to the government. So this is sort of this is where the fireworks happen sometimes, where the government gets face to face with the committee experts, and the committee experts are making, pressing them with really, hardball questions, asking for information, questioning them about why certain human rights violations are happening, and really pushing them to improve their practices and be more accountable. So that's what we're looking for in terms of the process. The look-back period. When you're writing the report, you can't go back to, 20, 30 years ago. The committee is really concerned with what has happened since the previous concluding observations in 2011. So that's the relevant look-back period for the constructive dialogue and for the review. And that's really the period you should limit yourself to when you're writing a report. You can, of course, focus on the most recent information because that will be the most timely. That will be what the committee is most concerned about, is what the most recent developments are. But it's fair game to look back all the way to 2011, in this case, when the last concluding observations happened for Ethiopia by the Human Rights Committee. So, opportunities for civil society engagement. How do you get involved? Well, the primary way to get involved at this stage is to submit a written list of issues report. Submit this to the committee experts, and then they will read through these reports and take them into account as they prepare their list of issues. Down the road, there will be opportunities to have briefings with the committee experts. Usually these are done in person with closed door briefing, formal and informal briefings with the committee experts. Lately, some of the treaty bodies have been doing these online, but that in-person briefing at the soonest will happen toward the end of 2021. So there won't be any opportunity coming up this year. But there's also other opportunities for advocacy as well, in the form of additional reports and additional lobbying that you can do. So now we're moving on to the 10 steps to writing a list of issues report. And before I do that, I want to share with you how influential a list of issues report that civil society can share can be in influencing what goes into that list of issues. So I'll show you an example in just a moment. This document that you see on your screen here shows the connections between the list of issues the Human Rights Committee published for the United States and a report the Advocates for Human Rights submitted along with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty about death penalty issues in the United States. And you'll see the document is color-coded. In the box on the top left, you see the wording that the Human Rights Committee used in its list of issues for the United States, the questions the committee posed about the death penalty, and the information the committee requested from the US federal government. And you'll see underneath that the text of our report that we submitted. So the box and the text are color-coded to show the connections between the information we gave to the committee and what the committee put into its report. And you'll see there's a lot of color there. I'll scroll down so that you can see all the different connections between what appears in the box here, the words of the committee, and the information we shared with the committee about death penalty issues. And you'll see they drew a lot of information from the report that we gave to them. On the fourth page, you'll see an additional box because one of the issues we focused on in our report was the use of solitary confinement for people who were sentenced to death. And you'll see the committee had a separate paragraph requesting information about solitary confinement. And we included after that box the additional information we had given to the treaty body about solitary confinement as it pertains to people on death row. So this document is just a simple example of how a report that the Advocates for Human Rights submitted to the Human Rights Committee, how that information at the list of issues stage was incorporated into the list of issues that the committee published, and that the issues that the committee sent to the government of the United States for the government of the United States to respond to. So it's an example of how civil society can help influence the process of review and also help focus the attention of the Human Rights Committee when it's preparing for its review. So now we'll jump back to the 10 steps to writing a list of issues report. Here's an overview of what we'll cover in the 10 steps to writing a list of issues report. Steps 1 through 4 are for setting the stage. Steps 5 through 7 are about planning and gathering information. And steps 8 through 10 are about implementation, how we implement the steps and come up with a report. We'll also end this part of the presentation with best practices and things to avoid when you're writing a report to the Human Rights Committee. The first step in the process is to identify your expertise. That might be you as an individual, it might be you as a concerned member of the diaspora, or it might be a group that you're affiliated with. But you and your colleagues have some kind of expertise. Now, you might not have a PhD, you might not be a professor or a lawyer, but you know something about what's going on the ground in Ethiopia, and that's your expertise. So it might be a particular issue that you're passionate about, that you have received firsthand information about. It might be that you have particular advocacy goals or things that you want to focus on, and you want the Human Rights Committee to pick up those goals as well. You can also think about, in terms of your expertise, your resources. Who can help? Who can help you put together this report? Who can help you gather information? What role can they play? And if you've decided you're going to do a report, you want to enlist people to help as soon as you can. So it's really important to think about what is your core area of expertise that you want to focus on in the report. Because you're not going to write about everything, every possible human rights issue in Ethiopia. You want to focus, and you want to help the committee focus on the issues that you care most about. The second step is to identify allies. You want to think about who can you work with in preparing this report. They might be organizations, they might be experts, they might be community activists. Now, you might want to collaborate with them in the writing process, or simply at the end ask them to sign on. But it's good to open those lines of communication early on so that people know what's coming. You can also think about other allies. They might be networks. There might be research institutions you would collaborate with, or international NGOs or non-governmental organizations. They might provide you with information or tactical tips or training or support throughout the process. Remember, as you're planning, that there's power in numbers. So any one person can submit information to the Human Rights Committee or any one organization, but there is power in numbers. So if you can show multiple organizations endorse the same report, that gives your report more authority and more moral force in front of the Human Rights Committee. You can also think about strategies to reduce the risk of reprisals. Now, there are some people, especially in the diaspora, who are concerned, and this doesn't apply only to Ethiopia, but they're concerned that if they are active and loud in criticizing the government of their home country, then their friends and relatives back home will face reprisals. So you want to think carefully about what strategies you can undertake to reduce the risks of reprisals. So not naming names unless you have express permission, for example. Or collaborating with other international organizations so that the government will feel like they would maybe not dare criticize international organizations in the way that they might criticize an individual or a smaller group, or having a larger coalition to make it harder for the government to single one person or group of people out for targeting. The third step in the process, and this is where things get a little bit technical, but this is probably the most technical it gets in the process, and it's not too bad, is to identify the rights. What are the rights that you want to talk about? And you can look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I'll show you a link in just a minute. And the covenant is broken down into different articles that relate to civil and political rights. One important article to pay attention to is Article 2, Paragraph 1. And this is the non-discrimination article in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights talks about a lot of different rights: the right to political participation, the right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. And so all of those rights exist under the covenant. But an important piece of that is when a state party ratifies the covenant, they agree not only will they protect those rights and uphold those rights, but that they won't protect and uphold those rights in a discriminatory way. So that means that there can't be rights for some people and not for others. There can't be distinctions of any kind, as it says in Article 2, Paragraph 1. No distinctions such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So that would include, for example, if the government is, if there's the right to peaceful assembly, for example, that right can't be denied to people because they're Oromos and given to other people because they're members of a different ethnic group. That would violate Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the covenant, as well as the provisions of the covenant that talk about the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. So it's important to take a look at the covenant and identify the rights that are there. Now, in your report, you're not going to go into a lot of detail about what those rights mean, because your audience, if you'll remember, are the treaty body experts. They don't need you to explain what the covenant says because they know very well, they have the covenant memorized, they're very familiar with the language of the covenant, but you should think about what those rights are as you frame your report, because that's how your audience thinks about the issues. They'll be thinking about them in the terms of the covenant. And so if you think about organizing and framing the issues in your report, always turn back in your mind to, oh yeah, this is what the covenant talks about in terms of non-discrimination, in terms of the right to peaceful assembly. Where you're really going to add value is not in talking about what the covenant says, but talking about what's going on the ground. That's where you're going to help the committee do its job. Step 4 is to review the committee's process. You want to read up on what has happened so far with Ethiopia and the Human Rights Committee as it relates to the rights you've identified. So you look at the outcome of the last review, which is the concluding observations, and the state party report. You see on your screen a link here, and I will now switch over and show you how to navigate to that link and show you what you will find at that link. So here we are at the Advocates for Human Rights webpage, and you'll see at the main webpage, you can go to the Take Action page. And if you hover over Take Action, you'll come down to Human Rights Violations in Ethiopia. You can also navigate directly to this page by going to the main page and typing in Ethiopia Human Rights. You'll get to the same location. When you come to this page, you'll see as you scroll down at the United Nations, and it says there's an advocacy opportunity, that's what we're talking about here, to contribute to the UN Human Rights Committee's review of Ethiopia's human rights record. If you scroll down, you'll see the relevant documents. The Human Rights Committee 2011 concluding observations for Ethiopia are saved at this link. If you click it, it will come up as a PDF. And the state party report from early 2020 again is linked here. If you click it, it will open up the PDF of the state party's report. There are also some other resources on this page I'll mention right here. We have a template that we've created that you are welcome to use for submitting a report to the Human Rights Committee for this list of issues stage. If you click this the link, you'll get a Word document that you can use as a starting point. There's also a link to Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, which is the Advocates Toolkit on how to conduct fact-finding, engage in advocacy, and promote accountability. So you can click over to that. There's also a link to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So when you want to familiarize yourself with the treaty language, that's a link that you can use. So these links should be useful resources for you if you are preparing to do a report to the Human Rights Committee. There are a couple of other things I want to show you while we're here on the Advocates website, some other tools that might be of use to you. So if you go back to the main page of the Advocates for Human Rights, then click in the toolbar, click Deadlines. You'll come to our deadline database of upcoming opportunities to engage with the United Nations and regional human rights mechanisms. So you can look at the main page for general opportunities applicable to all countries, and then you can also select a country. So if we go to Ethiopia, for example, you will see that we have an upcoming deadline for the Human Rights Committee, the list of issues stage, and the deadline is August 17th, 2020. That's a confirmed deadline. There's also another deadline in March 14th, 2021 with the CEDAW committee. And if you don't know what CEDAW is, you can just hover your cursor over the abbreviation and it will tell you it's the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And this is a follow report. And you might say, well, what's that? Hover over and it will tell you it's a follow-up report. And the description over here tells you what that is: provide information on the implementation of certain recommendations that were in the concluding observations. So that's that follow-up procedure that I mentioned earlier. So that's another useful resource for people looking to engage with the United Nations and regional mechanisms. Another place I want to draw your attention to, if you start with our main page, if you type in / and then change, you will find our toolkit, Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, a step-by-step guide to human rights fact-finding, documentation, and advocacy. And this is a toolkit I mentioned before. Chapter 9 focuses on advocacy at the United Nations. There are a lot of other chapters about how to conduct human rights monitoring, how to write a report, how to engage in advocacy at various levels, and then a lot of appendices that provide additional guidelines for engaging with these resources. So that's another tool that you can find on our website. So now that you've had the chance to review the committee's process, what's in the concluding observations from 2011 and what's in the state party report, you're ready for step 5. Step 5 is clarifying your role. What information do you have about what the government has done to implement the recommendations from the last time around? What information do you have about problems or gaps in the state party report? And what issues do you want the committee to address? What do you want to make sure that the committee experts don't forget about or don't ignore when they prepare for the constructive dialogue and when they issue their concluding observations this time around? You can provide on-the-ground information about what's actually happening in Ethiopia. You can provide firsthand accounts. You can also provide analysis. So you can look at what the law says and why that law is problematic in the context of what actually happens in the country. You might have specialized knowledge you can share. You might have other information you can share. Where you are going to provide the most value to the committee experts is letting them know what's happening on the ground. So clarify, what information do you have that will help the committee as it prepares to review Ethiopia's human rights obligations. Step 6 is setting goals. Now, we're at the list of issues stage. So what we're expecting from the committee at this stage is the committee will issue this list of issues, and the committee isn't going to make recommendations at this stage. It's going to pose questions. It's going to ask questions about what's happened since 2011 when we wrote our last concluding observations. So the committee is essentially engaging in fact-finding and is going to request information from the government. So your goal is to shape those requests for information. Later on in the process, as we get closer to the constructive dialogue with the government delegation, your goal will be to shape the concluding observations and the recommendations that the committee members are going to make to the government of Ethiopia. But that's later in the process. So at this stage, our focus is really drawing information out of the government of Ethiopia and helping to focus the committee's attention. So at this stage, as you think about what your goals are, you want to identify priority topics you want the committee to focus on. So think about what your priority topics are and think about what would you like the committee to ask of the government of Ethiopia about those topics. Then the next step is to make and implement a work plan. You're going to connect steps 5 and 6. Remember, step 5 is clarifying your role. Where do you have expertise? Where can you get firsthand information? And step 6 is setting your goals. What do you want the committee to ask about? So make a connection between those two and gather information. Keep track of your sources, make sure that you're keeping track of where your information is coming from, and pay particular attention to credibility and relevance. Make sure that wherever your sources are coming from, that they are credible sources, that it's not simply information that's spread on Facebook that might be, photographs or pictures that are being misconstrued or that are outdated or that are distorted images. Make sure that your information is credible and relevant to the committee, relevant to the issues that are part of the human rights that are in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Right, and make sure that the information is recent. Like the look-back period roughly should go back to 2012, so don't share information from 2002, for example. The committee won't care about that information. As you make and implement your work plan, you're gonna You can also plan to use the report beyond the United Nations review. The United Nations is just one audience for this report that you're creating, but there may be other people you want to share this report with, so think beyond that as well. Step 8 is to write the report, and you want to set up a writing team. And you'll take information from steps 4 and 7. Remember, step 4 is reviewing the committee's process, what happened in the concluding observations from 2011, from the last time around, what's in the state party report. And then step 7 is making and implementing the work plan. So that information that you gathered in step 7, and you're going to pull that all together into a report. And in your report, you're going to incorporate proposed questions and requests for information, those goals that you established in step 6. So sometimes it helps to start with the proposed questions and requests for information and frame your report that way. Say, okay, we really want the Human Rights Committee to ask these questions to request this information. So write those down first, and then write the factual information, the on-the-ground information that will prompt the committee to say, yeah, we really need to ask about this. We are really concerned about this. We want to hear from the Ethiopian government about those issues. So focus on what your end goal is, those questions, those requests for information from the committee, and put all of your troops behind those end goals so that you have the factual information that will support those questions and requests for information. It's very important when you're writing the report not to use abusive language. I know people can get really upset about human rights violations. They get very concerned and emotional. But remember that your audience, your first audience for this report are these independent experts. These are professors, generally speaking, who are they try to be more guarded in their language, and they can be put off by abusive language that seems incendiary. So you'll have a better reception for your report if you avoid really strong adjectives and really derogatory language and all of that. Your audience will respond negatively to that kind of language, and will respond much more positively if you're able to describe your information with a more neutral tone. There's a word limit for the report. That's 10,000 words. Now that's the maximum, and these reports don't need to be that long. In fact, the committee really appreciates short reports. So there's no need to write a novel for the committee. You want to be short and sweet and to the point. Suggest your questions and your requests for information, provide the factual information that forms the basis for it, and you don't need to write a whole bunch. Just give the committee what it needs to make the decision about whether to pose these questions or not. Step 9 is to finalize and submit the report. The deadline, as we saw in the deadline database, is August 17th, 2020. There you have the email to submit the report. That's also on our webpage. And as an option, you can get stakeholder input before you submit. So if you want to circulate a draft of the report to people who are directly affected to make sure that they're okay with the report, maybe they have some suggestions for improving the report or additional questions they would like you to suggest to the committee, you can include that. And then recruiting sign-ons. As I said before, there's strength in numbers. So if you can circulate a draft report before the deadline to get other organizations to sign on, that will make your report stronger, because you'll be speaking not only for yourself as an individual or your organization, but also on behalf of multiple organizations, and that makes for a stronger report. Step 10 is advocate. Now, during the constructive dialogue, when the government representatives will travel to Geneva to meet with the committee experts in 2021 or 2022, there's an opportunity for advocacy with the committee. If you're able to travel to Geneva or have your representatives in Geneva represent you there, then you can have formal and informal briefings with the committee before the committee engages in that constructive dialogue with the government of Ethiopia. And then after the concluding observations come out, then there can be advocacy to persuade the government of Ethiopia to implement those recommendations, because sometimes the governments need a little bit of nudging, a little bit of help to go along. Sometimes they need a lot of nudging. And having civil society reach out to the government to say, look, the Human Rights Committee made these recommendations. Let's work together on implementing them so that 5 years from now or 7 years from now, when it's time to report again, you can show the committee that you made progress. So let's work together on making that progress. But advocacy can go beyond the UN review and your work with the government of Ethiopia, or to press the government of Ethiopia to better respect its human rights obligations under the covenant. You can use your report and your engagement with the process to promote longer-term social justice. You can use the report as a tool for education and outreach, whether it's with members of the diaspora, whether it's with people who are interested in learning more about human rights issues facing people who live in Ethiopia, but you can use your report as a tool. And what you see in the photo here is one of our volunteers who did a report to a different treaty body. This was the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights for its review of Ethiopia, and he is presenting his report to a group of students at the University of Minnesota. So reports can be a great tool for raising awareness with a wide variety of audiences. Best practices and things to avoid in treaty body reports. A best practice is to frame each issue. So start with what your proposed questions and requests for information are, and use those to frame your arguments and organize your report. You can say, here's the government's position, or here's what the law says, here's what's in the state party report. Then here's what's really going on. Here's what we know is happening on the ground. Here are the problems. Here's what individuals are telling us. And then here's what we need to know. In other words, here's what we need the committee to ask the government about. Here's what we need to gather information about so that we can get good recommendations going forward. Another good practice is to use examples to highlight problems. They might be examples of gaps in the law or barriers to implementation, or just examples of ways in which what might be in the laws or in the constitution of the government of Ethiopia, there might be great text there, but there might be examples where that law is not being followed and there's impunity, for example. So you can use examples to highlight where things are breaking down. Use those as case studies. Be sure also to provide footnotes for all sources, including interviews, information you receive via email or messages. Make sure that you have documentation of all your sources. Now, you don't have to name your sources in the report, but you should have a source for each thing so that you later on can track down, okay, this is where I got that information. And make sure that all of your sources are credible. Things to avoid. You don't need to go into a lengthy procedural history. You don't need to talk in detail about what the committee said in 2011 in its concluding observations. You don't need to go into detail of what the state party report says about an issue. You can offer brief summaries there because those documents are already in front of the committee. You also don't need to have a lengthy discussion of what a particular right means. Remember, you're talking to the experts in the committee, and they don't need you to lecture them on what the right to peaceful assembly means. They want you to tell them what's happening on the ground in Ethiopia about the right to peaceful assembly. Is it being respected? Is it not? And give examples of where there are problems with the implementation of those rights. You also don't need to provide lengthy legal analysis, so you don't need to go into a lot of details. Sometimes it's helpful to explain if there's a problem with a particular law and how a law is worded, then legal analysis is helpful. But you don't need to go into a lot of details because generally the committee experts are more concerned with the facts. What are the facts on the ground? What's actually happening? So you can also avoid the tone of a legal brief and avoid vague suggested questions. So you think about what you want the committee to put in its list of issues, what kind of questions you want it to pose. You don't want the committee to say, how has the government of Ethiopia violated the right to peaceful assembly? That's a vague question. It's kind of a loaded question. It's not going to be particularly helpful. Whereas you could suggest a question that says, with the committee has received credible allegations of peaceful protests being met with excessive force and fatal use of force. Please respond to allegations that the law enforcement authorities are using lethal force on peaceful protests. And you can give specific dates and circumstances of those protests to prompt the government of Ethiopia to offer a response. Or, for example, you can suggest that the committee pose questions about what the consequences have been. So if sticking with the topic of peaceful protests and the law enforcement using excessive force, you could suggest a question that is, what steps have been taken to ensure accountability for excessive use of force on the part of law enforcement in response to peaceful protests. So that way the government can't say, oh, there was a riot and we had to do something. The government has to say, okay, here are the steps that we took to ensure that there's accountability. We did an investigation. If they did, if they didn't, then they need to say that. So you can suggest questions that will help draw out that information from the government in its response to the list of issues. If you have questions, you have my name and my email address up on the screen. I've also included as a reminder that link to Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, Chapter 9 on advocacy at the United Nations. And at the bottom of the screen, you again have that link to the webpage that I showed you that has the links to the Ethiopia human rights documents that I showed you earlier in the presentation. So I hope that that gives you a good overview of what you can do to engage with the Human Rights Committee at this stage of its review of Ethiopia's human rights record. Remember that the deadline is August 17th, and that's a strict deadline. So make sure you get your reports together and get it submitted, get it emailed to the committee by that deadline. And a reminder, the report doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be long. Your goal at this stage is to get information to the committee and to suggest questions and requests for information that the committee can make to the government of Ethiopia so that your issues will be part of the Human Rights Committee's review of Ethiopia that comes up next year. So I hope that information is all useful, and I wish you lots of luck. And if you have questions, please reach out to me and I'll do my best to help you running up to that August 17th deadline. Good luck.